Good morning and welcome to the Cushwa Center Seminar in American Religion. My name is John McGreevy. I am not Kathleen Cummings, who is the director of the center and your usual host. I teach in the history department here and I serve on the advisory board for Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. We want to extend a warm welcome, especially to those of you who are joining the seminar for the first time. Twice each year, for over 40 years, the Cushwa Center hosts the Seminar in American Religion to give historians of North American religion and other interested scholars an opportunity to discuss a notable book recently published in the field. The topic of our seminar today is Kathleen Sprows Cummings' book, A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, published this year by North Carolina. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this morning, beginning with our author. Kathleen Sprows Cummings is known to all of you, and she is the William W. and Anna Jean Cushwa Director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and a professor newly promoted in American Studies and History here at Notre Dame. Her teaching and research focus on the history of women, Catholicism, and American religion. After completing her doctorate at Notre Dame, she spent 2 years as a Lilly Fellow at Valparaiso University. She returned to Notre Dame as Associate Director of the Cushwa Center, and she was appointed Director of the Center in 2012. In 2009, she published New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era with the University of North Carolina Press as well, which received awards from the Catholic Press Association. With Scott Appleby, also here today, she co-edited the volume Catholics in the American Century, Recasting Narratives of U.S. History, published by Cornell in 2012. She also co-edited with Timothy Matavina and Robert Orsi, Catholics in the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event, published in 2017 with Cambridge. And she also edited Roman Sources for the Study of American Catholicism, 1763 to 1939, a guide to 59 archival repositories in Rome and at the Holy See, published in 2018 by Notre Dame Press. In addition to directing the Cushwa Center, Kathy oversees the History of Women Religious, History of Women Religious, an academic organization devoted to the historical study of Catholic sisters. She served as president of the American Catholic Historical Association in 2017. This past spring, some of you may not know, she delivered the commencement address at her alma mater, the University of Scranton, where a few weeks earlier she had received the Pedro Arrupe Award for Distinguished Contribution to Ignatian Mission and Ministry. Kathy serves as a frequent media commentator on contemporary events in the Catholic Church. She appeared on NBC's live coverage of the Papal Conclave in March 2013, the canonization of Popes John Paul II and John XXIII in April 2014, an event appropriate for this book, canonization, and Pope Francis's visit to the United States in September 2015. She's been quoted and published in the New York Times and a wide variety of other media outlets on a variety of topics, notably the clergy sex abuse scandal, again facing the church. A round of applause for our guest this morning, Kathy Cummings. We are fortunate to have two excellent commentators to get our discussion going, Christine Heyrman and Kevin Schultz. Christine Lee Heyrman is the Robert W. and Shirley P. Grimble Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. She earned her PhD from Yale. She teaches courses on American history, particularly the Civil War, and her research focuses on early American social and cultural history. Her publications include Commerce and Culture, the Maritime Communities of Colonial Massachusetts, 1690 to 1750, and notably Southern Cross, The Beginnings of the Bible Belt, which won the Bancroft Prize in 1998 and was a Cushwa Center Seminar on American Religion book in 1999. Her 2015 book, American Apostles, When Evangelicals Entered the World of Islam, received the 2016 Francis Parkman Prize. Christine's latest project, and I do know that you'll want to read this, forthcoming in 2021, is entitled Doomed Romance, Broken Hearts, Lost Souls, and Sexual Politics in 19th Century America. She's been the recipient of fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome, Professor Heyrman. Our second commentator is Kevin Schultz, Professor of History, Catholic Studies, and Religious Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he is also Associate Chair and has already served as Chair of the History Department. He received his PhD from Berkeley in 2005. He currently teaches 20th century American history with special interest in religion, ethno-racial history, and American intellectual history. His first book, Tri-Faith America, How Post-War Catholics and Jews Held America to Its Protestant Promise, was published by Oxford, and it charts the decline of the idea that the U.S. was a Christian nation and the rise of the idea of Judeo-Christianity. His second book, Buckley and Mailer, The Difficult Friendship That Shaped the 1960s, examines the fascinating intertwined lives of William F. Buckley and Norman Mailer as a way to understand the 1960s. In addition to reaching #1 on Amazon.com for new releases in U.S. history for a brief, wonderful moment, Buckley and Mailer received, and I am only quoting here, the 2016 Robert F. Lucid Award from the Norman Mailer Society. Kevin has won several teaching awards, including the Teaching Recognition Award from the Council for Excellence in Teaching and Learning and the Shirley A. Bill Award for Outstanding Teaching at UIC. He's a past president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History and has been published in the JAH, Journal of American History, American Quarterly, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and Labor History, and numerous other popular and scholarly outlets. Again, welcome, Professor Schultz. For those of you who are new to the seminar, a quick note on our format. We'll hear from each of our commentators first for about 15 minutes, and then Kathleen will have an opportunity to respond to them briefly. After a coffee break, we'll reconvene and open the floor for general discussion. I'll ask Professor Heyrman to begin.
Thank you so much, Professor McGreevy. Can everyone hear me? Good acoustics? Okay. Probably you are thinking that I have got no business being here. Why Heyrman? That's what you are wondering. After Professor McGreevy's introduction, that what I do is Protestant evangelicals. And so you're thinking, shouldn't she be working in her own lane, doing something useful, like figuring out why so many evangelicals still support Donald Trump? But I want to tell you, you could not be more wrong. I am the ideal person to weigh in on Kathleen Sprows Cummings, a saint of our own. In fact, during my pre-Vatican II Catholic girlhood, the lives of the saints came to consume my imagination, as they did for so many of my 8th grade classmates at the parochial school of St. John Vianney in suburban Milwaukee. We attended Mass every day before lunch, and whatever piety plummeted along with my blood sugar, I would divert myself by trying to learn a little Latin, matching the English words on one side of the missal to the Latin Mass on the other. But then one of my classmates got a hold of a book called Lives of the Saints, and it made the rounds at Mass among the 8th graders. Now, the guys got off on the gory stories of sadistic torture of martyrs, but the girls, well, this girl anyway, particularly liked all those gutsy take-charge women, the virgins who defied Roman authorities, the abbesses who stood up to their male clerical superiors. And some of these female saints even got their own holy cards. And I owned several. I see so many nods around the room, people in my cohort, yes. So you can appreciate how this experience in my impressionable youth made me an eager reader for a book about the ways in which, as Professor Cummings writes, saints serve as cultural indicators. Her goal, and it's as ingenious as it is ambitious, is to recover the ways in which more than a century of saint-seeking would define and defend and celebrate Catholics' identity as Americans, celebrated for themselves and advertise it for non-Catholic Americans, for European Catholics, and for Vatican leaders. Now, when she speaks of saint-seeking, Professor Cummings means the pursuit of canonization by advocates in the behalf of a particular prospective saint. And as her readers quickly realize, that's an arcane and complicated process, one that might elude comprehension even by Catholics. So it's not the least of her achievements to have wrought a learned and truly transnational institutional history. It's a history that spells out with unfailing clarity and lucidity the steps that are involved in canonization and how that process changed over time. But Professor Cummings' achievement goes far beyond wrapping the reader's head around the intricacies of canonization. Now, in part, that accomplishment resides in taking unsparing measure of the distance between the reality of a prospective saint's life and the way in which it was represented by his or her advocates. And so we learn that Francis Cabrini, far from being a fully American candidate, an ideal immigrant turned citizen, as she was touted by her supporters, that Cabrini was, in fact, a woman whose lives and loyalties transcended national boundaries. She was a missionary to all the world who just happened to die in the United States. But what's even better is Professor Cummings' insight that the study of saint-seeking can tell us as much, perhaps even more, about the interests and priorities of those promoting canonization as it does about the prospective saints themselves. Now, the subtlety of this approach to her subject, the gimlet eye and appraising gaze that she turns on those advocates of various candidates for sainthood, that left me wanting to know even more about them. Now, to be sure, you could not ask for a shrewder or more balanced exposition of the intense and creative politicking that accompanied quests for canonization. Nobody does it better than Professor Cummings in this book. She deftly reconstructs every tactical maneuver of the various advocates. She dissects every tension and rivalry among them, tracks their every move through the Vatican bureaucracy. And the very skill that she brings to unfolding that narrative made me curious about their deeper promptings and motives. Exactly what did this cast of saint-seekers hope to gain, temporally, spiritually, personally, publicly, and among what constituencies, by orchestrating successful campaigns for canonization? What was at stake here for these folks? And also, did the anticipated and actual rewards of pursuing canonization change over time? There was a single sentence of hers that started me wondering about what was at stake here, as I said. Describing the high-handed tactics of one fellow, one Salvatore Bergio, an oily advocate for Anne Seton, Professor Cummings allows herself to wonder whether he was, and I'm quoting her, more committed to Seton's glorification or to his own. Good question. But what did such glorification entail? What's involved in this? And chasing after an answer to that question would, I suspect, afford us some intimate insights into the culture of American Catholic religious orders, and perhaps also into how they envisioned their relationship to the laity and the wider non-Catholic public. Addressing that question would also present a tempting opportunity for comparative study with American Protestantism. Now, as everybody in this room knows, Protestants do not have saints, officially speaking. But trust me, they sure did suffer sorely from, we might call, saint envy. As you might guess, that saint envy surfaced early in the 19th century, continued into the 20th century. It is a side effect of the steadily rising numbers of Catholics in the United States, and especially native-born Americans who convert to Catholicism. And in fact, during the same decades that Protestants were busily ripping off both interior and exterior design elements from Catholic churches and refashioning their own churches in that popish image, they were also finding ways to make over some of their best-known believers into virtual saints and martyrs. Foreign missionaries served as the choicest and most popular candidates for this makeover because their exploits loomed so large in both the religious and the secular press during the 19th, early 20th century. Now, biographers of these men and women explicitly and forcefully denied that they were doing any such creepy Catholic thing as turning Protestant missionaries into saints, which means, of course, that's exactly what they were doing. And Protestant ministers who were doing it, who were writing these hagiographic memoirs and biographies of missionaries, they seem to have done it, at least in part, to claim some measure of sanctity by association, and thus to gain greater stature within religious circles. So, did the same desire animate Professor Cummings's Catholic advocates? Consider, for example, her observation that it was no coincidence that Mother Ann Seton's ascent to sainthood paralleled the rise of her fervent supporter, Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York, his rise to prominence on both sides of the Atlantic. And so the question arises, could we be looking at a symbiosis here with Spellman prospering as much from his proven success as an advocate for Seton as his growing fame speeded her progress toward canonization? Are these two folks battening on each other? Anyway, it would be interesting to explore the possibilities for this kind of comparative hagiography in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and to analyze Catholic and Protestant candidates for sainthood or virtual sainthood, and to raise the questions of who got promoted for sainthood on both sides, by whom, when, and why. And it would be really interesting to find out whether the canonization of American Catholic saints, so ably traced by Professor Cummings, whether that heightened or retarded the hagiographic impulse among Protestants. You see, I really do belong here. Now, no appreciation of Professor Cummings' book would be complete without some mention of her impressive recovery of the role of women religious in American saint-making. Her account takes us through the days when canon law explicitly prohibited women from participating in the process of canonization without male mediators to the breakthrough of the 1940s. During that decade, women like the redoubtable Sister Isabella Toohey began angling to act as their own standard bearers in advancing the cause for Ann Seton's canonization. Women religious attained greater solidarity within their own ranks. They defied overbearing men like the noxious Salvatore Bergio, I hope there's no relative in the audience, and sought to represent themselves at the Vatican. And after Vatican II, Professor Cummings writes, as consecrated Catholic women sought more control over their own lives, they would also claim more authority over the afterlives of their spiritual ancestors. Great stuff. I got to tell you, what I really admire about this exposition is how staunchly Professor Cummings resists writing a tale of triumphalism. She renders the limits of change with nuance, with unfailing complexity. She shows that an opposition to feminism arose among the ranks of some women religious, which in turn made canonization a contested terrain among women religious themselves, and also that a mounting concern for activism and the support of civil rights and social justice. This also drew women religious away from sustained involvement in canonization, as did the concern that pursuing canonization would force women candidates into conventional gender roles as defined by the male clergy. Just, a really nuanced take on this whole history. Now, like all really good books, A Saint of Our Own opens up plenty of opportunities for future inquiry. And I came away especially eager to hear more about the people in the pews, the laity. In part, that curiosity owes to my admiration for Bob Orsi's work, and I'm thinking in particular of his book on the devotion of Catholic women to St. Jude, which impressed upon me the intense and complicated attachment of the laity to the saints. But my curiosity about the laity also owes to an experience that I had long ago on a playground. That would be the recessed yard behind the Jesu Church and School, a spot nestled into a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, right across the street from John Carroll University. There, in the mid-1950s, my classmates had a particular way of dividing into teams to play Red Rover and dodgeball. Are you Irish or Italian? One team captain demanded, eyeing my 7-year-old self appraisingly. Mystified, I told him that I was an American. This was not the right answer. You can play with the Irish kids today, he told me, but by tomorrow, find out who you really are. Who I really am. This was confusing to me at the time, but in retrospect, it's fascinating. All these kids were American-born. For some, their grandparents were of the immigrant generation. For many more, it was their great-grandparents or ancestors even farther back. Yet my classmates in the mid-1950s did not think of themselves as American Catholics. Instead, they still identified with their family's country of origin. Now, that history of diversity, the fierce loyalties to and the identification with ancestral cultures on the part of the laity, whether Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Latino, African American, this complicates any effort to generalize about American Catholics as a group, even as late as the mid-20th century. And it raises the question of whether and to what extent these diverse Catholic laymen and women of earlier decades actually felt the need to establish their Americanness or to gain acceptance as citizens of the United States or to locate models of American holiness or later look to prove that they had succeeded in attaining those goals, that they had triumphed over religious prejudice. In fact, we know that some members of the immigrant generation, most notably among the Italians, they didn't want to be American. They wanted to go back to Italy. And even if some or all Catholic lay people did in fact feel a need to affirm their stature as American citizens, did the canonization of American saints actually answer those needs? Well, maybe not. Maybe not, and that's what helps to explain the why popular lay enthusiasm for any particular saint, like Francis Cabrini, why that proved to be so evanescent. So, as we like to say in the history biz, further research is needed. Professor Cummings succeeds handsomely in demonstrating that leading Catholic clergymen, forceful women religious, prominent Catholic lay intellectuals, that all these folks were bent on Americanizing their faith, and they sure did use saint-seeking as a strategy for doing it. That's how the likes of John Gilmary Shea and John Ireland and Leonard Feeney, that's how they represented their efforts, that they were seeking a saint of our own, to coin a phrase. But there can be a wide gulf between representation at the top and reception at the bottom. How church leaders represent what they're about and how the laity understand what's going on. So there's your next book, Kathleen. I would love to know, we need to know more about how a diverse Catholic laity understood and responded to these top-down campaigns for saint making. I sure did enjoy reading this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming out. Thank you, John, for inviting me, and thank you, Madonna, for doing such excellent work to bring us all here successfully, and thank you, Kathy, for writing such an excellent book. And it's sort of intimidating to go after Professor Heyrman right there. It's heartening to know that some of the reflections that I have are similar to hers, but it's also disheartening to know that I could never do it as good. But here we go. In July 2009, so a little more than 10 years ago, I was a newly minted assistant professor at University of Illinois at Chicago, and the ever interesting and certainly eminent Professor Robert Orsi, who got a mention a little earlier, he had just moved to Northwestern not too long before then, and he invited me to dinner at a cafe in Evanston. The place was called Trattoria Dock. It's on Main Street there. It's just a really lovely place. And it was one of those rare, perfect Midwestern evenings when you can sit outside in shirt sleeves and talk about life and talk about all the problems with the world. And for those of you who know Bob Orsi, know that he loves nothing more than talking about the problems of the world. He's very good at it. He and I hadn't met in person yet before then, although looking over our correspondence to get the date right for this talk, I noticed he had once emailed me advising me on who might fill a chair at UIC, and he recommended, let's see if I get this right, one Kathleen Sprows Cummings for this chair we had open at UIC. The outcome of that story is for another time, although this Cummings person seems to have done quite well for herself, I think, but we can talk about that later. Nonetheless, Bob and I chatted on this glorious evening, which obviously still evokes such wonderful memories to me. He probably hated the evening, but as academics do, we bemoaned the fact that our work wasn't being listened to as much as we supposed it should, and this is the author of, Madonna on 115th Street, which has sold 17 bajillion copies or something like that. But this is what I was hearing from him. But I was chewing on an idea, and I shared it with him at that dinner. And he, his response was ever memorable to me. I had before then just previously taught for the first time a class on the American Catholic experience, the big survey in American Catholic history. And I had done a lot of reading to get myself in gear to prepare for that outside my special areas of specialty like we have to do. And I realized that most historians of the American Catholic past had written very circumscribed histories. Most of the time, these books were amazingly detailed, but they gave remarkable insights, but on very specific orders or bishops or events or people. They were by Catholics, about Catholics, for Catholics. And this was fantastic, but when I was trying to broaden this into the American historical understanding, it was also incredibly frustrating. What they failed to do, I suggested to Bob, was what I call turn the corner or make the turn. And I couldn't figure out which term, and he was not very helpful in helping in figuring that out. But I wanted these scholars to raise their eyes from their very specific topics and discuss how their actors influenced and were influenced by the greater American society that surrounded them. There were lots and lots of details, but not much social, cultural, political, or intellectual analysis in these books. We're still, most of the time in these books, the scholars were failing to miss sort of the dialectical relationship about how the United States changed because of the presence of a quarter of its population being Catholic, for instance, and how Catholics changed being in this American environment. And to me, that was greatly frustrating. And since my role here today is something of a celebrant as well as a critic, a friendly critic, I might as well directly mention that both Bob and I talked about some works who stood outside this fold, and the prominent name of John McGreevy came up as somebody who was doing work that was actually doing what we were calling for, and there were others who were doing it as well. And as I was going back through my notes, I realized they all have relations with the Cushwa Center. So well done to the Cushwa Center for recognizing this as well. But nonetheless, there seemed to be this gap. And as I laid out this argument to Professor Orsi, he grew increasingly animated in a way that only he can, and he urged me to write an article about this. It was important, he said, for the Catholic story in the United States to be better braided to the larger American story. It was a necessary transition that showed a maturation of scholarship, a sort of non-self-serving way to detail the existence of many great and problematic and ironic components of this dialectical relationship. Historians, he felt, were behind the curve. Most Catholics themselves were well enmeshed in American society, but historians of the Catholic experience were still playing catch-up. So I was incredibly excited by this intellectual fist bump from Bob Orsi, and I went home and scribbled down a few pages of what this article might be, and then I woke up the next morning and I realized, darn it, I have to get tenure first, so I need to turn to the book, and I wrote the book, and I eventually ended up getting tenure, and I still have that sort of partially composed essay sitting in my saved folders, and I think about it a lot more than you could probably imagine, turning back to it. Now, I harken back to this event of now more than 10 years ago because of the remarkable consonance it has with Kathy Cummings' new book, A Saint of Our Own, which we're here to discuss. Her subtitle does a lot of work in making the argument, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American. But I think the subtitle isn't quite right. And I think I can safely say that here because I'm pretty sure, and she can blame it on the editor if she wants, but it was the editor who suggested it, right? Yes, they always screw it up somehow, but there we go. And so I spent way more time than I should have trying to ponder possible subtitles that would have maybe more narrowly captured it. But the book was already out and blah, blah, we're here today. But I thought a more proper subtitle, which is too wordy, but it might have been something about how the quest for a holy hero demonstrates the changing nature of Catholic America. Something like that. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, which is the way I procrastinate, I guess. But I think that really gets to the heart of her argument, how the quest for a holy hero demonstrates the changing nature of Catholic America. And in short, the book's argument is this. For the last 150 years or so, American Catholics have put forward dozens of possible people for sainthood, and their efforts, by and large, have mostly, at least until the last 30 years or so, been pretty brutally and not quickly, but prolonged rebuffed. But those who are put forward and how they are presented reflect their own advocates' changing needs and rather than the deeds of the actual people who are being put forward for sainthood. In other words, for those of us who teach American Catholic history, which is a great number of people in this room, Cummings' argument is that we need to recall that when we teach the American saints, when we teach people like Francis Cabrini or Catherine Drexler or Elizabeth Seton or John Newman, it's as, if not more important, to study the moment that they are canonized alongside the deeds they did in their lifetime. This is a study in a way of inventing traditions that work for our own time or these contemporary times as opposed that make sense to the time of those who are being proposed for canonization. As Cummings puts it, and there's so many great sentences in this book, I should say, well done, not written by your editor. As Cummings puts it, new American moments generated new models of holiness. To demonstrate just one telling example, one of the most recent people canonized was Father Damien de Veuster, who's better known as Father Damien or Father Damien of Molokai, who willingly went to the island of Molokai in the 19th century to service the sufferers of Hansen's disease, which is better known by its now antiquated name of leprosy. He willingly went to the leper colony to work with the infected. And his story is legion, and we've known about it for a long time. And Hawaiians themselves on the island, they celebrate his birthday as a state holiday. He's a very well-known person there. But as Professor Cummings points out, in just sort of one revealing example of what the argument is, Damien did not become widely identified as an American saint until the onset of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. As Catholics and non-Catholics ministered to victims of another disease that led to societal and religious ostracism, they adopted Damien as a model of compassionate care. And then he was successfully raised to sainthood. And President Obama, a Hawaii native, no matter what your President Trump that you mentioned earlier says, President Hawaii gave his accolades at the canonization. There's a prodigious amount of research in this book, and flipping through the footnotes is just a fantastic experience here and abroad. And this comes to the fore in sort of Father Damien has one moment, but perhaps the sort of more dramatic telling and the centerpiece of the book, I think, concerns the attempts to canonize Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was born of the American Revolutionary era, founds a number of schools and prominent institutions, including and most especially the Sisters of Charity. And the reason she's the centerpiece of the book is simple. It's because she was up for canonization for almost 150 years. She was finally raised to official sainthood in 1975. But what's fascinating is how each generation remade Seton to fit their own needs, depending on what it was that the American society was calling for. Eventually, she's bypassed in the race to sainthood, if we want to put it that way, which is how some of the Catholic advocates put it, by Frances Cabrini, who's sort of the first American saint, but I say sort of only because she wasn't born in the United States, nor did she spend many years in her childhood here at all. But the reason is because Cabrini spoke to the people better at a different time. She was an immigrant who ministered to immigrants in the time when the U.S. Catholic Church was an immigrant church. It was her moment and not Seton's. By studying the various and winding paths to sainthood, Cummings is able to show us in really fantastic detail the entirety almost of the twists and turns of the American Catholic history writ large. It's really fantastically done. We see the disorganized church and really minimized and disrespected church of the 19th century failing to get the job done in Rome. We see the splintering of the faithful claiming diverse routes to Seton's talents. We see the immigrant church. We see the brick and mortar church of the early 20th century. We see the wartime World War II church proclaiming infallible Americanism. We see the civil rights church. We see the feminist church. We see the church grappling with all of these issues. And Seton is presented by the faithful differently each time. It's really remarkable. It's really remarkable how her biography gets rewritten every generation. And as Cummings puts it, the stories U.S. Catholics tell about saints often correlate to the stories they tell about their own experience in America. Or again, the faithful see in their holy heroes what they want to see about themselves. That's really one of the things that us historians work to uncover is history, as they say, is told by the winners, which is sometimes often true, but not entirely true. And what is the story that the winners want to tell about themselves and what gets left behind? And these are the kinds of questions that Professor Cummings unpacks in her book, and it's really, really well done. A few points stood out to me as I read the book. One is how immature and disrespected the American church was until really the middle of the 20th century. You kind of know it, and then you see how disrespectful Rome is of the American attempts to canonize somebody. Just it's humorous in a way if it weren't so sad. Getting the first American saint takes basically half of the book. It happens on page 118, right? Getting the second American saint happens in the next half of the book. It happens on page 196. And then the last 20 pages, or 30 pages or 40 pages, whatever it is the rest of the American saints. And Cummings explains why this is in really interesting detail, which of course she pauses to reflect on, saying that there was a time when Americans and American Catholics needed the church writ large more than the church needed it, and then that flips. And when that flips, there are ramifications in all sorts of ways, including who gets canonized and when. Another point worth mentioning is that Sparrow is rightly sensitive to the ironies of the story. We historians are not always the best at seeing ironies in history, but they're always there. But Cummings really excels here. Is it not ironic that saints who are supposed to stand as exemplars for the eternal church can shapeshift in our collective memory so quickly? The church isn't supposed to change, especially pre-Vatican II, and yet these people are changing and we're interpreting them differently depending on our own needs as time moves forward. Also, isn't it ironic, and I think that it's sort of comical in a way if it weren't so sad, that the 100 or so years in which the American Catholic Church was at its most vocal in the United States and dare I say at its strongest in the United States, the church in Rome canonized no Americans. And now that we're in an age where American Catholic realignment and integration into the social and cultural milieu of the United States is happening increasingly, we're getting saints galore. What's at stake there? Another point that came up, and I really appreciate this because I love stories, Catholics have great stories. So many good stories here, and Cummings points out many of them. I loved it when in the mid-20th century, at this high moment of Catholic confidence in the United States, Time magazine was even proposing who they thought should be saints, and number one on the list was Newt Rockne. Right? Which I wasn't sure how that joke would play here, and then I passed the Newt Rockne freeway stop on the drive here and the Newt Rockne statue, and I think, okay, this one's going to work. I don't think he's been elevated yet, has he? No, not yet. Okay. I love it when history tells us stories about, for instance, Francis Cabrini, whose life was extended by almost 6 years in the remarkable event that there was some crisis at a New York hospital that forced her to alter her travel plans by 2 or 3 weeks. So she came home early, came back to the United States early. She was truly a cosmopolitan citizen of the world, but she came back to the United States early. So she altered her itinerary, and if she had stuck to her itinerary, she would have died on the Titanic. I love it when these stories show up. Right? And thank you for sharing them. Perhaps my favorite story, again, relates to the relationship between Rome and the United States. Seeing the United States grow in power and wealth, but not yet prestige, in 1925, Pope Pius XI asked the prefect of the Sacred Congregation, "Why can you not give me an American saint?" One wonders about his motives in asking that, of course, but why can you not give me an American saint? The prefect was exhausted because he had been trying to put forward an American saint for 75 years, and he was totally frustrated by this question and said, "I can't give you one until they in Rome give me one." The U.S. wasn't powerful enough, at least in Rome, to get a saint across the line. But the story that's even more interesting is the corollary, which she points out. A half-century later, when American Catholics were firmly integrated in American soil, and indeed seemed to be maybe slipping away from the church in increasing numbers, a person from Rome's Congregation for the Causes of Saints said to St. Louis's Archbishop John May, "We need somebody, not from Philadelphia, to be canonized in the," it gets more specific, "to be canonized in the United States, and a woman, and a religious would be really helpful. Go find that person," right? Now it was Rome that needed the United States more than the other way around, and that came with a very specific commandment. What a fascinating story to dig up that quotation. Thank you for finding that. Now, good books, of course, elicit questions as well as compliments, and of course I have a few questions, and as Professor Heyrman put it, avenues for further research. Such a nice way to put that. And here my comments actually overlap quite nicely with Professor Heyrman's. One question that I would have liked Professor Cummings to say a bit more about, and I realize this is a bit outside our wheelhouse. We're famous for saying, what I wanted you to do was more that you weren't supposed to do. You know, it's not a fair question, but nonetheless, this piqued my interest. why certain very famous Catholics have continually been overlooked. She mentions some of this, and her book is about how these saints are made in some ways, not how the ones are overlooked. But I'm curious to know what's going on with the First Maryland Catholics, or even the Carrolls of Carrollton. What's going on with Fulton Sheen? What's going on with Dorothy Day, especially? And so maybe in the commentary when we or in the Q&A when we talk a little bit more, we can find out about how today's politics are affecting possible saints of the future. I'd be very curious to hear you talk about that. A second question goes, and I'll sort of shorten what I was going to say because Professor Heyrman said it deals with the question of the laity. And what is it that the laity is getting when they propose or advocate on behalf of certain saints? I understand why the Jesuits or the Franciscans or people of certain orders would put forward their own people. I mean, there's a little self-interest there, I can imagine. But it seems fascinating to me that a lot of the calls are not necessarily coming from the laity. So I would like to hear her talk a little bit more about the relationship between the laity and the various orders and people who are in power who are putting these forward. And this was really evoked when I went on a run through campus yesterday and I saw the shrine to the Lord's Shrine, which is really spectacular on campus. Candles lit, people worshiping and praying outside. It was fantastic to see. And then I'm wondering, why do Americans really need their own saints when there are so many sort of universal saints that they can adopt as their own? So I would have liked to hear a little bit more voices of the laity, and I'd hear her to reflect a little bit further on what the laity gets out of it. And I think we got a partial answer with your opening story in a way. And the final question that I'd like to hear a little more on deals with my sort of opening gambit about getting scholars of American Catholic history to engage more centrally with the story we tell about the American past more broadly. And this I know you've thought a lot about because you tell several tales where Catholics for some reason think canonizing an American saint is going to endear them to American Protestants who hate them. So, and you're very open about how weird that might be. So you're aware of how this sainthood question is going to make Catholics look to the broader American public. But so my question is this: because the push for saints has been both inward struggle among Catholics and outward in how Catholics in the United States want to be perceived, how have Catholics struggled to defend the cause of sainthood itself in a more sort of rationalizing, secularizing world? And I kind of liken it to the royals of England, which are ever fascinating in a way, but not terribly important to the governing of Britain. So how do saints sort of parallel in that? If we are in sort of a more secular age, how does the cause of saints or canonization processes suffer in the United States? That would be sort of an interesting question to tie in the Catholic past with the American past more directly. And to bring it back to Bob Orsi, I was wondering how he would reflect on that question. But fortunately for me, I got the answer when I flipped to the back of the book and realized that he blurbed the book. And like me, he felt the same way when he said, "I could not put a saint of our own down. This is a great book." Bob is nothing if not full of opinions, and here's one that I think we can agree on. So, thank you very much.
Okay, this feels very strange to me. I'm used to sitting in that seat, and I want to thank John for hosting, for moderating, and also for insisting that we do this book for the Seminar in American Religion, which I felt somewhat sheepish about, but I thank you because it's so much more fun than I thought it would be. And thank you, Professor Schultz and Professor Heyrman, for those wonderful comments. Now, as most of you know, I have hosted dozens of these things, and I always take a moment to impress upon our guest author the importance of keeping his or her comments brief and to resist the temptation to respond to every single question and point, because we really need to get to the discussion. And I feel really bad about that over the years because I realize now that's a really hard thing to ask someone to do. So I'm going to try to be attentive to time here and resist that temptation myself and practice what I preach. But I'm so grateful for these comments. And it's just a wonderful thing. Other authors have told me this, but to look around and see your book on the table and that people have actually read it and engaged it, it's just a really wonderful thing to have that evidence. So thank you. Thank you all. I did not know that background, your background and your personal interest in the saints. And I loved that opening story, and your questions are so good. And I wish I had used the words, oily and noxious to describe Salvatore Bergio. I had some choice adjectives, but I don't think those actually appear in the book. So thank you for that. I have wondered, in retrospect, if I was too judicious in talking about him. I mean, I think he was really a terrible person, and I don't think I ever actually say that, so I'm glad that came across. Was he interested in Seton's glorification or his own, which speaks to your broader question about what was at stake? I just thought I'd start with a story of an experience I had that really shaped this book and the research on it, and that was attending the canonization in Rome of Brother Andre Basset, who became the first canonized saint from the Congregation of Holy Cross. So unlike the Jesuits with boatloads of saints, Holy Cross did not have one until 2010, and I wanted to attend that canonization as I was starting to think about this book, and I thought it would be good to experience that. And we were I was there as part of a Notre Dame contingent, but there were many more Canadians. He died in Canada, lived and died in Canada, although he visited Notre Dame in the 1930s. And it resembled nothing so much as a sporting event, Notre Dame football game. Everybody was waving flags, everybody was cheering. I expected a rather solemn occasion, and there were about 5,000 pilgrims there for Andre. But because canonizations are so elaborate, they almost never occur for one person. People are canonized on multiple days. So another saint being canonized that day was Mary Mackillop, who is a sister of St. Joseph from Australia, who became on that day the first saint from Australia to be canonized. And 13,000 Australians had traveled halfway across the globe to attend that event. And let me tell you, the Australians know how to throw a party. So we were all, the Andre fans, they were fans, were dwarfed by the exuberance of the Italians. So I was starting to think about this book about nationalism and sanctity and how they might be intertwined. And I had read about the canonization of Francis Cabrini in 1946, but I felt like I was witnessing what it actually meant. And I was, of course, asking all my new Australian friends that I made that morning, what does it mean to you? And what they talked about, they didn't express it quite in that way, but that Australia, this outpost, this nation on the other side of the world, is very much a part of the universal church. It's the church recognizing that. So I think it was a hinge between the local and the universal. And also that moment, there's a moment in canonization when the Pope says, Mary Mackillop is a saint, and everybody just goes wild. And, you know, to quote Orsi again, who comes up quite a bit in these stories, this moment where heaven and earth are connected in this very palpable way. It's just a really, it can be a very powerful moment. Beyond that, beyond the theological, I think it has a lot to do with Elizabeth Johnson's book on saints is called Friends of God and Prophets, and she talks about saints as friends of God, but also your friends. And I think it really is, you know, we all have friends that we want to be closer to because they're kind of in with somebody that we'd like to be in with, and like, hey, I'm with her. I know him, I know her, and that person is really close to God, and that person is holy. And I think that is more universal. It's bigger than a Catholic story, and all cultures have people that elevate people that are seen as better than them. We all do this with our friends. We all want to be around people that are better than us. We think are better than us, are holier than us, aspire us to be better people. And I really see that dynamic at work here. And I think that is what is at the heart of, I love the saint envy, which I didn't really expect or appreciate the extent of which. I think a lot of Catholics thought the saint seekers that I write about thought that Protestants envied, but I really found evidence of that. And more is saint opinions. I was surprised at how many non-Catholics have had very distinct opinions on who should be canonized and why. I did a phone interview yesterday with a reporter from Indian country talking about the potential canonization of black elk. And she said, I'm not a Catholic, I don't know anything about Catholics, but I don't think the Catholic Church should canonize black elk because they're just trying to atone for abuses in Native schools, and it's really inadequate. And I mean, she may be right about a lot of those things, but I was just so struck by, certainly with the canonization of Pius XII, too, the investment of Jews in saying he should not be canonized. So I think that's a really interesting question. I do wish, or maybe not, maybe for a different book, but a comparative story. I think that could be very fruitful. And this could have been a different book. It could have been a history of American holiness, not American Catholic holiness, and leave out the Rome part of it. But what are the American virtues that kept popping up, and did they translate across religious traditions? I think they did, and I think that would be really interesting to. And actually, that's a story I intended to write had it not been for that trip to Rome in 2010 for the canonization of Brother Andre, which occasioned my first trip to the Vatican archives. I was intending to write a book that was really just about the American side. And I was hoping to ignore the process. I didn't want to try to figure out the arcane process. That was an element of the story I didn't think I would do, but I came to realize how important it was. And I had echoes of Peter D'Agostino, our late lamented colleague, who the last time I saw Peter was when the Seminar on American Religion did his book, Rome in America. And it was with echoes of him that I visited the archives and was actually escorted there by a mutual friend of a good friend of Peter's, because I had no idea what I was doing, and I needed a guide in that. I think I did emphasize the Rome part of the story and therefore not think more about the broader comparative elements, and I think that would have been a great book and one I'd like to think more about. So what's at stake? It's a process of heroification. Who becomes the people that we look up to? For Catholics, the heroes are literally better off dead, because once they're dead, they have that in with God. So I think that the broader story, it's a story about American heroes. So again, more to think about there. I thank you for pointing out the element of canon law and finding out that women couldn't even be represented except through a male proxy until 1983 became a much more important element of the story than I had thought of. And here again, I think there's a lot of room for comparative work to think about feminism, Protestant women in mainstream Protestantism becoming, as someone put it recently, riding an elevator in a crumbling building. So American women become leaders at a time when the institutions matter less. So I think there's an element there. People in the pews. Okay, so Bob Worsey. How long did it take before Bob Worsey came up? When Bob, this answers, I think, both of your questions. When my editor sent me Bob's blurb, I was really surprised, because Bob and I had been working on a project together, editing a book for most of the time that I was writing this book, and I realized I had talked to him less and less about it throughout this process, because I really thought he was going to hate it. And so I called him to thank him for the blurb, and I said, I thought you were going to hate this book. And he said, why would you think I would hate this book? And I said, because I started out wanting to write a Thank You, St. Jude, but about the American saints and about the laity and about the people in the pews and what it was that drew that to them. And then the institution and the process took up more and more space, and I tried to balance the Rome part of it with the American part of it. And I said, I thought you'd think there were too many bishops in it, too much church politics, too much Rome. And he said, listen, you've convinced me that story is really important. He said, I don't want to write it, but I'm really glad you did. And I think, so anyway, I was very gratified, of course, to see the blurb and to hear Bob's compliments. But I think I did, in an effort to try to blend lived and ecclesiastical history, probably tilt the balance too heavily toward ecclesiastical history and lose some of that flavor and some of the evocative way that he and many others have written about personal devotion to saints. It did not come across, at least in the way that I had intended it to. But I do think, to go back to that idea, I think it's, what did the people gain from this? It was a friend, an advocate, and the proximity that the saint seekers felt to their candidates was really palpable. They felt like they were right there with them along the way. I think, in terms of some of your questions about representation, I think, and this has only become clear to me after the book is finished, now that the book is finished, I've had a chance to think about it and engage with others about it, is I think it really does demonstrate the limitations of the immigrant church as a paradigm for telling the American Catholic story. I think that the subtitle, which was not my subtitle, and we could talk about that all morning if you like, I think that the way we tell the American Catholic story has been dominated by Euro immigrants, and the saints that were chosen to elevate reflect that. And as I say in my very short epilogue, I think it demonstrates the inadequacy of any one of these figures being able to be a stand-in for the American Catholic story. And I think some of the dozens of saints that are being proposed now might open a way to retelling the Catholic story that doesn't focus so much on the Americanization paradigm of Euro-Catholic immigrants. So that's something I'm interested in thinking about. But again, that's a story too about the laity. Where are the laity in all of this? The subtitles. So, we fought about this, my editor and I, and I said, it's not about how they became American. They already were American. They were sort of trying to understand what it meant to be American, express that. And she said, everybody's going to know what you mean by that subtitle. And sure enough, the first interview I did said, what do you mean when you say a holy hero helped Catholics become American? And I didn't want to get into, I didn't actually say that. Somebody else said that. And so, I don't think I could have gotten your subtitle past the editor about demonstrate. I think it's a good one, and I wish we had talked about this a little earlier, come up with something a little punchier. But yes, I don't think it's. I don't think it explains exactly what saint seekers were trying to do for this. I don't think it adequately captures this. I didn't like the cover. I didn't like the title. We can just go. It's one of the alarming things about, you think you write a book and you think you have all this control over it, and then you actually don't, as it makes its way out into the world. Seton became the centerpiece only because it's such a complicated story. I had originally relegated her story to a single chapter that was going to be a pivot chapter at mid-20th century, and I was just going to start telling her story then. And then a year into writing this chapter, I realized that was not going to work, and it was either abandon the entire book or figure out a way to weave her story through and make it the centerpiece. So that's what I did, and that's why she wound up on the cover so prominently, even though it's not really about her. It's about the many saints with whom her story is intertwined. The disdain that is felt in Rome, that I have to say I'm a little sensitive about, because that disdain is still very real in terms of Rome and Americans who feel like the Vatican officials kind of look down at you like you have no idea what you're doing. That's still the case, at least from an archival perspective. And I think there are moments that when Seton's advocates sponsor a pilgrimage to Rome in 1931, think about that. They're going to march through the streets of Rome waving banners saying, we need her to be canonized. That's a very American thing to do. And of course, in Rome, they're like, who are these crazy Americans? And there's no way that's going to help her cause advance at all. And, I had an American priest, the only American priest who works in the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, tell me very early on in this project that this isn't a book. That's not a book. You can't talk about change over time in the history of canonization. There's a very meticulous process, and we follow it to the law, and you're crazy. He kind of said that. But of course it's not true. But from the perspective of the Vatican, it is unchanging. This process has been in place for centuries, and yes, modified, but we measure it very scientifically, and there's no way there's any favoritism or anything like that. Even in the case of John Paul II, who's canonized very quickly after his death. They make a point to say the process was followed meticulously. Even though it may have been accelerated, one official compared it to, you have a stack of causes and you pull out one from the bottom of the pile and put it on the top, but the process is still maintained. The integrity of the process, which again is seen as divorced somehow from time and from circumstances, is maintained through that. So I think it's an ongoing tension that we're seeing with many of these saints galore, as you say. I think, Cardinal Spellman and that, in terms of power, I think absolutely his star was yoked to Seton's in a way, and he wanted that moment in the sun. He got to preach the homily at her beatification mass in 1963, so a first. It was his moment to shine, even though it was allegedly about her moment to shine. It was his as well, and by extension, all Americans. And I just thought that was so fascinating. Spellman, lots of people have written about Spellman and his diplomatic efforts, but here in something as trivial as saint making, he became very invested in this, and I thought that was an interesting way to think about how popular devotion can mirror broader themes that have been considered more important, how we can integrate those themes. Thank you, Kevin, for mentioning that story about 1925, Why Can't You Give Me an American Saint, and then the counterpart to it with John Paul II. That letter I was sent by an archivist for the RSCJs in Chicago. We need someone not from Philadelphia, and a woman and a religious would be helpful. That was a wonderful moment to see that, and also to think about. I had always understood what I had read about saint making, that John Paul II democratized the process. He made it more easy. He made it easier for Catholics without wealth and privilege and proximity to canonize people. He made it less ecclesial, involved the laity more, and that's all true. But here's an instance where he very much centralized the process by sort of handpicking who it would be. I think that letter was really important, but just to tell a wider story, the archivist sent me only half the letter, and she said, I'm only sending you half the letter. I've scanned half the letter. And I can't let you read the rest because they say really bad things about the Vatican and Rome. The sisters, this is two sisters writing to each other, a provincial in St. Louis with a sister based in Rome. And you have to understand they had just been through a very tense time with the Vatican and getting their rules modified. And so I can't let you read the rest of the letter. But of course that translated into a reluctance to say, sure, we'll move forward with this cause that is basically already there, Philippine Duchesne. And the provincial superior who's reporting the conversation with Archbishop May says when she received the call, I couldn't put this in the book. I wasn't allowed to put this in the book, but she resisted the temptation to respond with her first impulse, which was, in my heart of hearts, I don't believe in canonization. So I had that in the book because it's a money quote. It's awesome, and it was central to my whole argument. And I was following up with the archivist when it was time to get the detailed information for the footnote, and she said, you can't use that line. That reflects badly on this sister who's now 101 years old living in a nursing home in St. Louis, and I don't think really cares. But anyway, she wouldn't let me use it. And I suppose we could have battled it out, but I didn't see a point in doing that. But that speaks to this tension about a sizable group of Catholics, many American women religious, who are resisting identification with the institution in this way for good and valid reasons, which I understand, but I do wonder about the implications for that. So anyway, that's a great letter, and I think the narrative arc, if Philippine Duchesne could have been the central, I could have woven the story around her because like Seton's, it extends. She's a very early candidate, and then she's not canonized till 1988. Canonized at the wish of Rome, really. And another thing that I didn't put in the book because I was unable to corroborate, but Darn, don't you hate that when it's a really good thing, but you don't have evidence for it? But Ken Woodward, in his book Making Saints, reports that part of the sisters' reluctance to move forward with her canonization was the expense involved, and that South American alumni of South American Sacred Heart institutions agreed to finance the cause, which is just a wonderful irony. This is the woman who started out as the North American analog to Rose of Lima, and whose canonization was in part financed by South Americans. But anyway, nobody could remember that, or no one would admit to it, and I couldn't find written evidence, so I couldn't put that in the book either. Okay. Kevin, your questions, I think there's a lot to talk about this open call. I mean, Fulton Sheen and Dorothy Day, we could just go on and on about them. I'm happy to do that. I have wondered about John Carroll. There's an obscure website that proposes him as a saint, and I wonder why he didn't come up as sooner, particularly in the 1880s, as a saint. And I think that's also to get back to the story of the implications for retelling the American Catholic story. I think it's interesting that, Maryland, which is where we used to begin the story of the American Catholic experience, is less important than New France and New Spain. And where do we start to tell that story? So I think it's interesting that the Maryland people did not come top of mind when it came to be thinking about who represents America. European saints, I know Ellen Scarrett is here, and I know very early on in this project we talked about where's the little flower, and why couldn't she be incorporated as she was becoming? And she's in there juxtaposed with Cabrini, but there could have been so much more, because devotion to her in the 20s and the 30s was very widespread, and I think was part of this impulse. And I think it would have been a wonderful story to tell how the European saints in each age, which European saints did U.S. Catholics gravitate to, and I suspect that there are parallels in terms of the qualities of the story that appealed, but I didn't do that, and I think that would be wonderful. I love the comparison with the English royal family. I have to think more about that. Everybody is so invested, and we all get up early to watch the royal wedding, right? But it doesn't. What does it matter, actually? I need to think a lot more about that. That's a really interesting comparison. And all right, I think I'm going to follow my own injunction and stop there and wait to hear other questions and to tease out some of the answers to these good questions in our conversation. So thank you again. This is really exciting and fun.